to introduce our two speakers. We've got a double header, which is really exciting. First, we will hear from Mike O'Brien, talking about his new book, Monastery Mornings, about his childhood amongst the monks in Huntsville. So he'll speak to us for maybe about half an hour, and then we should have time for questions afterwards. And then we will tag in Bill and Elaine White, Huntsville residents that you maybe know them even if you don't know them because their barn is iconic. Their muraled white barn in Huntsville. You've seen it, I know you have. These two heroes stepped in and bought the monastery land at the 11th hour in order to save it. So we get to hear the latest updates about what's happening with that. And afterwards, we have a lot of snacks inside, just right inside the dining table. Feel free, help yourself to that. And then we will also shift to the back of the room where we have all of the books set up. So if you'd like to buy one of Mike O'Brien's books and have him sign it for you, then we'll have time to do that afterwards. And then you can ask a lot more questions. Any questions about any of that so far? Okay, and without further ado, I present to you the one, the only Mike O'Brien.
Thank you, Katie. I loved being able to do a program with so many Kates. My mother's name was Kathleen, and my sister named her three daughters Katie, Kater, and Kaylin. We call them the K-girls. So we didn't patent that phrase, so you can use it up here too if you want. Yeah, if you get sick of the Katies. And I'm really thrilled to be here tonight too. I'm sure everybody says that when they're here, and I'm sure everybody means it, but I really, really, really mean it. Because I actually lived just down the corner on Adams and 26 when I was growing up. I was an altar boy at St. Joe, so I walked Adams many early Sunday morning to serve Mass. Spent many happy hours at the library just up here. And I went to St. Joseph's, so I walked down to 28th and Lincoln and took a number of buses up to the high school. So this is really a very, very fun homecoming for me. So thank you very much for inviting me and welcoming me to this beautiful building, which I had been in before, but I always remember walking past it because I had a paper route around the block too. And I'd walk past here and I just sort of look like, wow, what a great place. It's a gorgeous building. And for history nerds, Bill and I have a little club, by the way, we call the Monk Nerd Club. But for history nerds, like hopefully everybody who's here, this is a really cool year for anniversaries, 2022. Because 150 years ago, last month, the first Catholic Mass was said at the home of Michael McGuire between Lincoln and Grant on 25th Street, somewhere. I came up early and I was walking up and down trying to figure out the exact spot, and almost got arrested, but they wondered what the heck somebody's doing walking up and down 25th Street. But there's no historical marker there. So I'm going to challenge the local Catholic schools to have their middle schoolers and their high schoolers go through the process of trying to put a historical marker up for the 150th anniversary of the first Catholic Mass in Ogden. So that's really exciting. Another anniversary, 50 years ago, I started going to the monastery in 1972. 50 years ago in October, Mother Teresa came to visit the monastery. There's lots of saints in Utah, but near as we can tell, she's the first Catholic saint to be here. Dorothy Day came up to the monastery in the early 70s as well. She's not quite at the saint level yet, but we're working on that, so maybe we'll have two Catholic saints up at Holy Trinity. But most importantly, this year, 75 years ago, the monks arrived here in Ogden and started the monastery. And so Bill and I have been brainstorming about what we could do to honor that anniversary, and got in touch with Heritage Foundation, and I'm proud to say this is the kickoff event for that year-long celebration of the 75th anniversary of the monastery. So I'm excited that you all could be here to join us in that. And you can go ahead and advance the slides, please, if you would. So we're going to remember the Utah Monastery. I'm the warm-up act, and Bill is going to take you home after that. And I'm going to talk about the monastery and its history and my own involvement with the monastery. And then Bill's going to talk about the wonderful story, the wonderful work he and Elaine are doing, along with others, to preserve the land as much as possible. Oh, and by the way, in terms of homecoming, I forgot to mention as well, I worked at the Standard Examiner right out of high school when Charlie was there. Charlie, I think, started there when he was 8 or 9, so I don't want to age him by talking about my time there.
Don't make it any worse than it is.
Most of these photos are from the archives of the monastery that the monks were generous enough to share with Bill, and that Bill has shared with me. And these are 3 of my favorite photos. Of course, some of the old-time monks picking potatoes, right? It's almost St. Patrick's month, so we have to talk about potatoes. The beautiful, iconic building, and then, of course, just this wonderful image of, I think, perhaps one of the most beautiful images of the monastery, a monk who's no doubt praying and irrigating at the same time, which is the monastic motto of ora and labora, which is Latin for work and prayer. So I just think that's a fantastic image. I'm sure it's totally spontaneous. I don't think monks ever staged things like that. So, I'm sure a monk would happen to be walking on the road with a camera and he saw one of his colleagues praying, and that's how we got that photo. Next slide, if you would, please. So 75 years ago, the monks arrived, of course. Little screenshot from the Ogden Standard Examiner on the day they arrived, July 10th, 1947. They took a train, 3 days train ride from Louisville, Kentucky. They were originally members of the Abbey of the Gethsemane in Bardstown, Kentucky, near Louisville, which is the monastery, of course, that Thomas Merton was from. Many of you have probably heard of Thomas Merton. Wrote a famous biography in the 1940s, The Seven-Story Mountain, written many books since then, still very well read today. For a short time on Amazon, my books were right behind his under the category of monasticism, which is a really hot category on Amazon. Wow, what a thrill. I thought for a moment I might overtake Merton, but that was hubris and I didn't. But Thomas Merton wrote a beautiful paragraph. I think he wanted to come to Utah. He wrote a beautiful paragraph in a magazine in 1947 describing the land. In fact, he was actually in correspondence with Father Frederick Dunn, who was the abbot of Gethsemane, who founded the monastery. And Merton has several entries in his journal talking about the development of the Utah monastery. But one article he wrote that was published by Commonweal magazine in 1947 was called "The Trappists Come to Utah." And he wrote this wonderful paragraph describing the land. So I'd like to start with that if I could. I wish I had written this, but I didn't. The monks have settled a wild and lonely spot. To the east of them is nothing but a wilderness without roads or farms. It is a paradise for hunters who, in the past, made the monks' ranch their home and worked eastward from that base. Deer come down to drink at one of the 2 plentiful springs on the Trappist ranch, and about the only sound you hear in the valley is the howling of coyotes on the mountainside. At least that was all you heard until the Cistercians set up their bell and began to ring it. All right, what a beautiful image. Bill's preserved that bell, by the way, and so we're hoping someday soon to be able to ring that again. But that was the setting when the monks arrived. They took a bus. They stopped at St. Joseph's Church for a few moments and then took a bus up Ogden Canyon. And when they arrived, their leader said, this place is a little bit of heaven, and let's endeavor to make it more so. Which I think is a wonderful counterpart to what happened exactly 100 years before that when Brigham Young arrived in the valley and said words to the effect of, this is the place. A little shot of them in their Pullman cars coming out from Louisville. And when they arrived, they lived in recycled POW buildings where Italian and German prisoners of war were held in Ogden. And so you see a couple of glimpses of the first buildings they stayed in, and then the first group shot of the monks up in Huntsville. Next slide, if you would, please. So some of the early days, of course. Here's, again, Father Maurice Lands, the first abbot, with Father Frederick Dunn, who actually died about 6 months after he founded this monastery. So he gave his life so we could have a monastery in Utah. The the bunks they lived in the recycled POW buildings, you know, the initial high-tech farming implements they used, horse and buggy, the start of the Quonset Huts, which were completed in October of 1948, designed by a Salt Lake architectural firm that's still in existence, who's very tired of me calling them, asking them to look through their archives and see if they could just try one more time to find any photos they have of the original blueprints or anything like that. And then a beautiful picture of Father Alan Hole, who we lost just last December to COVID, a young strapping former Navy aviator who joined the monastery right after he finished flying the sea lanes in the Aleutian Islands. Next slide, if you would, please. The land, of course, is spectacular in the south east corner of the valley, nestled up against the mountains. The monks started, of course, with the POW huts and then developed the Quonset huts that you see there, several photos of it. If you look through, which I'm sure you've all done, right? If you look through the archives of newspapers for the early, late 1940s, you've done this search, right? Quonset Hut, Huntsville. If you search it, there's actually it was actually quite a rage, a happy rage, that there was this monastery being built out of Quonset huts, and there's probably 40 or 50 articles all across the country, short, but talking about this unique building. And one of the Tribune writers, Jack Goodman, who was the architectural writer for the Tribune for many years, referred to it as the only Quonset hut monastery in the world. So he's a credible source like Charlie is, so I'm sure we can believe that particular statement that he made. But they were supposed to be temporary quarters. They weren't supposed to last as long as they did, and the monks had plans to build this beautiful Gothic monastery on a hill to the north, I believe, and to the west of where the existing monastery was. So, Bill, you could have had that building, right? So imagine, right? Imagine the fun. But you know, they didn't have enough money, and in the mid-'60s, something called Vatican II, the Vatican II conference, really brought significant changes to the monastic life, and so they decided to hit the brakes on that new building. They tried on 2 other occasions to build a new building, but never did. So the temporary Quonset huts were their building for the entire 70 years the monastery was there. And I'll let Bill tell you about the wonderful love and hate relationship that he probably had with that building, since he had to, I could just love it and admire it. Bill actually had to take care of it for several years, and so we can hear from him on that. Next slide, please. Of course, as I mentioned, Ora et Labora, the motto of the monks, and so monks at work. And this is how many of us came to know them, right? How many of you had the chance to try the famous Trappist bread, right? Delicious. Bill, about 6 months ago, found a baker and recreated that, and we held a picnic up at the monastery, and he gave us free monk bread, which was delightful. The eggs. My friend Brother Boniface was the head egg monk, and I worked with him in the beautiful egg chicken coop for a long time. They farmed, of course, so you see Father Patrick with one of the cows, and you see this beautiful photo of Brother Michael Flaherty from Philadelphia with piglets. I don't know if you can tell with the photo, there's these beautiful piglets there, but this was the photo that became the base that Bill used to put this beautiful mural on one of the walls of the barn, and that's the monk who that was based on. Another monk with a porcupine, very, very cool. And of course, part of the monk's work was to pray. And so you see them decorating, I believe this is for Easter, they've collected flowers and are decorating the pathway to the church for an Easter service. They weren't limited, of course, to manual labor, although that's a very strong part of what they do. This is Father Thomas Porter, who was actually the editor for Thomas Merton. And there's some great stories in Merton's journals about the battles he had with his editor. So even monks hate their editors, apparently. But I didn't know that until 10 years ago. And I knew Father Thomas quite well, but I never knew about his relationship with Merton. You see they did their own laundry, of course, made their own clothes. Father Bartholomew was a theologian. He also developed a special machine for them to put their creamed honey in cups, and he took care of the toilets. You talk about a man for all seasons, right? All three of those jobs were very popular in the monastery. Father Emmanuel dealing with new bells that were donated by the family of Brother Nicholas Prinster, who was the cattleman up there for many years. And when he was too old to chase after the cattle anymore, started making these beautiful grandfather clocks. I was fortunate, and I'll read a segment of that in a few moments. I was fortunate to get one of those last ones of those that was made. And it's not a grandfather clock, it's a table clock. But again, the monks don't retire, and so when they were too old to do one thing, they found something else to do and moved on. Next slide. Monks at prayer. Again, my favorite shot. Hopefully you had a chance to go into the Abbey Chapel sometime before the building had to be replaced. But it was a beautiful, unique Quonset hut chapel with beautiful stained glass window, especially compelling at night. Again, one of my favorite photos. And this particular stained glass window you can now see at Holy Family Church in South Ogden. And if you drive, Holy Family is situated so that the church runs east and west. And on the west side of it, they have this big picture window, and that stained glass window is installed right behind it and lit from behind. So you can drive from west to east along the main road there by Holy Family at night and see that beautiful window still lit up. And again, an early photo of the chapel with this statue, which again, she's had 3 different places at Holy Trinity. A 70-year-old statue that they imported from France, started in the church, for many years was in the garden, and again, I'll let Bill tell you where she is now. Next slide, please. Most critically, again, it was a brotherhood. And that certainly, as a young boy visiting the monastery, what was the imprint on me. And so you see the group shot of the monks I knew in the 80s. You see my friend Brother Boniface baking bread in the early days. You see this beautiful shot of Brother Felix comforting one of his brothers, Father Jerome, on his deathbed. And again, the very striking monastic funeral service, buried without coffins at those times, just in their robes in the ground. And Bill and Elaine are doing heroic work to preserve that cemetery as well. I have a fun story about Father Jerome. After college, he started writing to me during college. We became pen pals, and he said, come visit me after college. So I spent 3 days up there on a retreat after I graduated from the University of Notre Dame. And he kept telling me that I had to go to the Newman Center in Salt Lake. He told me over and over again, because I was about to go to law school at the University of Utah. And being a good Irish Catholic boy, of course, I did what Father Jerome asked me to do. And it was great, because that's where I met my wife, Vicki. So I had a monk matchmaker even, which is a wonderful experience to have. They didn't do a lot of matchmaking work. So, so far I'm the only person I've chronicled as the official monk match-made match. But maybe there's other stories out there that I'd have to tell on that. If you know of one, let me know. Next slide, please. So, why am I up here giving this talk? And why did I write a book about the monks? Well, in the 1970s, early 1970s, we were living in Clearfield. We moved here in 1973 to 26 in Ogden. My parents got divorced. It's a pretty devastating experience for the family, because my mother was this wonderful Irish Catholic woman, Kathleen Mavorning O'Brien, who grew up in Burlington, Vermont, and didn't want to be anything other than a mother and a housewife. And in the early 70s, she suddenly found herself divorced, single mom, with 4 kids to raise, me being the youngest at age 10. So she was struggling to find her way in the midst of that unexpected and undesired change in her life. And when she was young, it was her uncle, a Catholic priest, who sort of watched out for her. Got her into an orphanage because her mother died when she was in 3rd grade, and her father was an alcoholic and not present in the family. So it was a nun, her aunt was a nun, and her uncle was a priest, and they sort of watched out for her for several years. So I think that's why one day she started taking us to the monastery. And we arrived there in a rather serendipitous way. Gas was 30 cents a gallon back then. If only that could happen again. Oh, if only history could repeat itself, right? And one day, Mom, in the midst of this divorce turmoil, said, let's take a ride. And so we did. My sister was driving. I was in the back seat. We ended up in the Ogden Valley, saw signs that said monastery with arrows to follow. We followed the arrows. We went through the beautiful gate that said Abbey of the Holy Trinity at the top, drove up the hill and saw the monastery in the background. It was a Saturday and the building was open and the bookstore was open. We ran into Brother Felix and Mom was looking for a book and she said, "Brother, can I tell you what I'm looking for?" And he didn't let her finish her sentence and he said to her, "I know exactly what you're looking for. The same thing as the rest of us, peace." So it was the beginning, to steal a line from Casablanca, of a beautiful friendship. And during the next 11 years, roughly, from age 11 through 21, I was up at the monastery 2-3 times a week. As I mentioned, working in the chicken coop, in the bookstore, helping them chase down calves, driving tractors. I don't think I added remarkably to the efficiency of the operation. I think more than anything else, it was unique for them to have this snotty little 11-year-old kid hanging around. But they kind of liked it, so they took me under their wings and they let me hang out with them. And they talked to me. They talked to me and they told me what they were doing. And they made me feel welcome, right? The great secret of monasticism, I think, is that we all need a place to belong and someone to belong to. And for me, these men became those men, and this place became that place. So I was really lucky. I didn't realize at the time, but the divorce in the family turned out to be a good thing because I never would have spent so much time up there without that difficult event happening. This is a picture of me with Brother Boniface, right? I was a lot cuter back then, I think. At least that's what everybody in my family tells me. You see a photo of my mom and my sister with Father Patrick there in the center. You see me with a couple of novices up at Holy Trinity. And you see the beautiful moment in October of '72 when the monk said, "You got to be here for 6 a.m. Mass because this really important woman's going to be here named Mother Teresa." And we said, "Who?" And sat right behind her as she made a visit to Holy Trinity Abbey. Of course, you know the rest of the story, right? Nobel Peace Prize, canonized as a saint, just a remarkable figure in the history of Catholicism. Next slide, if you will, please. I wrote this book because I'm still friends with the monks, and I wanted them to be remembered. And I was afraid that people would no longer stumble upon the monastery like I did. So, I was hopeful that maybe they would stumble upon my book and be able to read about these men. And before I tell you about the current relationship, which again is equally wonderful, I wanted to just read a chapter from the book. Probably dreading that, a whole chapter. What time is this thing supposed to end? It's a very short chapter. It's, in fact, the first chapter that sort of sets the tone for, I think, the rest of the book. It was an honor for me to write it about the monks. Chapter 1. A Trappist monastery in a quiet, isolated, and rural corner of one of the least populated of the United States is not the typical hangout for a preteen American boy. Yet, there I was. Not only was I at the monastery, but one morning I was talking to someone the monks had described as a well-known theologian, scholar, and writer. I wish I could remember his name. It was the 1970s. He was visiting there to lead a multi-day retreat for the Abbey's 36 monks. I was there visiting the Abbey with my family. Perhaps just to be polite, the famous theologian struck up a conversation with me. As we chatted, we stood on the carefully tended lawn just outside the green, rounded-top Quonset hut that served as the monastery's main chapel. The conversation was mainly casual small talk. The theologian noted the Abbey's beauty. Set on 1,800 acres of lush mountain farmland and hills in the rural Ogden Valley under the watchful eye of Mount Ogden, the monastery indeed was a lovely place. I was a pretty good conversationalist for a preteen, perhaps because of my Irish heritage, genetic Blarney implanted into my DNA. I also was a voracious reader, arming me with a ready arsenal of surprisingly clever things to say that one might not ordinarily expect to hear from someone my age. A few weeks earlier, I had read a promotional pamphlet about the Abbey in the monastery bookstore. A phrase it used to describe the Abbey caught my attention. I did not know exactly how to respond when the theologian commented on the magnificent setting for our casual conversation. So I simply repeated the descriptive comment I had read in the monastery pamphlet, to remarkable effect. The conversation stopped suddenly. The theologian paused and looked at me with an odd expression on his bearded face. He seemed surprised and a little impressed. Or maybe he just thought I was a shameless plagiarist, because he asked me, politely, if I knew that the words I had just mindlessly repeated like a parrot were from a famous poem written by a well-known poet. Of course, I had no idea about the poem or the poet. I just liked the words and the phrase. I had assumed that T.S. Eliot was just some guy like me who had visited Holy Trinity Abbey and been fortunate enough to get his name and clever comment reprinted in the monastery's brochure. Looking back at my conversation now, many decades later, my preteen self deserves more credit for insight, accidental as it was, than I gave him then. That young man somehow recognized, perhaps subconsciously, that he actually was standing at the still point of the turning world. T.S. Eliot in Ogden, Utah, Huntsville, Utah. So that's how it all happened. And again, it's been, like so many things, the monastery has been a matter of addition for us. It added to our lives. And we're still friends today with the monks. Here's a wonderful picture of my wife, Vicki, with Father Patrick and our first grandson, Wally, at the picnic that Bill held at the monastery last October. Bill and Elaine are truly remarkable friends of the monks. They care for them. They bring them up back to Huntsville regularly, either to the monastery grounds or to their home for picnics and get-togethers. The monks have become severely addicted to Elaine's potato salad, which apparently was not a traditional monastic food, but now is. And as the other monasteries hear stories about it, I think the demands will increase, Elaine, for that potato salad. So get ready to ship some to Kentucky and Iowa. We sadly lost two of the monks over this very, very difficult winter, pandemic winter, to COVID. We lost Father Leander, who was a priest for 70 years, worked with the poor in Brazil, and was the abbot at the monastery. And as I mentioned, we lost Father Allen, the Navy aviator, who you can see there in a very current photo with my family. And we were up there for an event that, again, I'll let Bill describe. My kids, I've forced them to go up to the monastery too and meet the monks. They don't seem to have been too damaged by that. And in fact, now they're in their 20s, so they kind of brag about it. But we were fortunate to get a beautiful shot of them on Abbey Road. So it's just been, again, now, the other day I was telling Bill just now, the other day I took one of the monks to his heart doctor. So, the relationship has changed, and instead of them taking care of me, I'm in a very fortunate position where I can give something back. But I'm delighted that, with three of them left, that I still have that opportunity to thank them in my own little way for our monastery mornings. Next slide, if you would, please. So that brings us to the close of the monastery in 2017, which is, again, about the time I started to write this book. As I learned the abbey was going to close. And again, because the monastery is always about addition and subtraction, some wonderful things have happened even though the monastery is closed. The lovely people of Huntsville made the monks the grand marshals to their July 4th parade in 2017. And you can see three of the monks, Father Patrick in the front and Father Allen and Brother Nicholas in the back, riding around in the parade. Which was just a momentous event for me. And the lovely story that most people don't realize is that the person driving them around in that buggy is a nephew of President David O. McKay, who also was a very famous and wonderful son of Huntsville. So again, the intersections that have occurred, the additions that have occurred from that place are wonderful. You see a beautiful shot of the cemetery, and again, I'll let Bill update you on that. You see a couple of barns that Bill has preserved in a photo that I took. The things will change, right? Life changes. But we're in a place now where that process of addition can hopefully continue to happen. And so I want to let Bill talk about that, but before I do, I'd like to read to you one of the words I wrote right after I visited the monastery for the last time in 2017 before it closed. I've been up there, fortunately, thanks to Bill and Elaine, many times since then. But this was in August of 2017, right before the Abbey officially closed. I visited the Abbey, my own home away from home, for the last time in August 2017, just a few days before it closed. It was my final monastery morning. I sat alone in the church and watched the colored lights of the stained glass window dance in perfect synchronicity with the silent echoes of 70 years of monk voices raised in chant. I walked down the tree-lined Abbey Road. The road cuts a path between two of the fields, both abundantly filled on that day with a late summer growth of alfalfa hay. I saw dozens of small white butterflies gently fluttering between the fragrant green plants. It was a dreamlike vision, almost as if all my boyhood memories had taken to winged flight, just so that they and I could be together, quietly, and one last time, in that lovely place where we had first met. And the next thing I did, as I mentioned, I went and bought one of Brother Nicholas's clocks. It may have been one of the last ones that he bought. But it sits in a beautiful table in our living room at home and chimes the hours, much like the bell, the monk bell rang for many, many years. So again, a matter of addition. The last point of addition I want to mention, before I belabor the theme too long, involves Bill and Elaine White, because I didn't meet Bill and Elaine until after the monastery had closed and I was writing this book. And either I found out about him or he found out about me, and we emailed each other and went to lunch. And again, it was the beginning of a beautiful friendship that I'm very, very grateful for. If I had to lose the monastery, I'm glad that I found Bill and Elaine to help replace it. And they are both doing wonderful things to preserve the monk's legacy. And I want to invite him up to talk about that now. And then after he's done, perhaps we can answer some questions. So, Bill White.
Let me know if this works for you. Thanks, Mike. I love to listen to Mike talk about the monastery, and we've spent countless hours doing that, much to our wife's chagrin. It's really inspiring for me to listen to him talk about his love of the monastery and the monks. And over the past 7 years, there's been a lot of times when I needed a lot of inspiration. It's been by far the worst thing I've ever gotten involved with, but also, in a weird way, the best thing I've ever done. My wife can tell you a lot about the worst times. She'd be happy to do that. The way that we got involved with this was my wife and I lived in Huntsville, and the town, we decided, we were newcomers, so I decided to volunteer for the town and see what I could do to help them. And they asked me what I did for a living, and I told them I was a water rights attorney, and they said, "You're hired for free for life." And so one of the things that I got involved with is all of the town's drinking water comes from a big spring that's located on the monastery. And so they asked me to go with them to the monastery to meet the monks and to talk about our joint management of this water resource. When they suggested that, I actually was dreading it because I just sort of had a vision in my mind about what a monk would be like. And I pictured sort of a sour, dour hermit. I don't know what I was thinking, maybe from TV or something I'd seen. So they dragged me up there, and we sat down and immediately hit it off with these delightful old guys who felt like they were your grandpa. They told jokes, they told funny stories, they were super warm, they gave us cookies, and we just hit it off immediately. Subsequent to that, a couple of years later, I got a call from Utah State University, and they told me that they were doing a big project for the monks. They were designing this huge development for the property. And so they wanted to talk to me about the water resources aspect of it. So when they came and explained to me what they were up to, I realized that they were planning this development to prepare the land to be sold for for the closing of the monastery. So I talked to the students and I said, have the monks talked to you about a conservation easement? And they said, yeah, there's been some talk about that, but the Catholic Church, they need the money. And so they can't really afford to donate the property for a conservation easement. So that kind of got me to thinking, and so I talked to some friends in the valley and was trying to get some friends to go together to buy the monastery and then to pursue this conservation easement project. Unfortunately for me, most of my friends are smart and said no, and so I was sort of on my own. Elaine and I were on our own. Eventually, however, my longtime friend and business partner, Winston Wainsgard, and his wife Charlene, after we had been in this a year or two, they decided to help us out, and they became partners in this and have really helped us out financially that way. But I want to jump to the end so that you understand what I'm talking about when I'm telling you about a conservation easement, because there's a lot of confusion about what a conservation easement is. A conservation easement is what it sounds like, which is it's an attempt to strip the land of the right to develop it so that it can continue to be what it has always been, which is a farm. And so the Department of Agriculture gives grants to help defray the costs of giving up all of your development rights on a property like this. And before we got involved with the monastery, my wife and I owned a little ranch in Hennifer up along the Weber River. And we had got the bright idea to put that property into a conservation easement. So we had started that process, and we were about 2 years into the process, and we thought we were about done, and we thought it was pretty easy to do. And so when the monastery came about, and I had talked to the students and I had talked to the monks about their desire to have it preserved, but they had no way of doing that. I thought, well, we could do for the monastery what we were doing in Hennifer, which is to purchase the property, apply for the federal grants, and eventually we would get a portion of our money back, but we would be able to preserve the property. So after a lot of hand-wringing, my wife and I agreed we would do this. So we started this process, but the Hennifer project quickly became what most conservation easements become, which is a huge, huge nightmare. And 6 years later, we finally got that one done. And now I've been working on this one for nearly 7 years. And we are basically done. We finished everything that we have to do. It's sitting on the desk of the Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C. They've approved the funding, they've approved the concept. They're just reviewing the documents, and there's hundreds of pages of documents. This takes years to accomplish. So I think we're done, and we should have been done 4 or 5 months ago, but COVID has the federal employees working from home and all that kind of stuff, so it's kind of slowed us down a little bit. But so theoretically, when it's all said and done, we will record a document with the county recorder's office, which strips from us the right to develop most of the property in any way. So it will continue to be a private farm, will be run as it has in the past, and hopefully that will just be able to continue in perpetuity. One of the things that we have been working on, and this is in large part because of my association with Mike. So when I got involved, I knew about the legal aspects of it. I knew a lot about the water problems that they had. And by the way, that was a whole year's worth of my life, sorting out their water problems. But luckily, my partner is also a water rights attorney, so we both spent a lot of time on that. But so I knew about those aspects of it. I didn't really know much about the history of the monastery because I'm not from this area. We grew up in Bountiful. I had never even been here, the monastery, until the first time I met him. And but then I got to know Mike, and he let me read a transcript of his book before it was published. We spent many, many hours wandering around the monastery and him inspiring me to understand the legacy of the monks as opposed to just the preservation of the land. And so he helped inspire us to try to take it a step further and to try to preserve some aspect of the monk's legacy. For example, this barn over here was in really, really bad shape. So we tore up the outside covering wood and resheeted it, repainted it, redid all the electrical because it was a giant fire hazard, because the monks are very spiritual, but they're terrible electricians. And then a good friend of mine, Jake Songer, we hired him to paint that mural, which, as Mike mentioned, is sort of a variation on the theme of the monk holding the piglets. And we were going to have him hold the piglets, but from a long ways away, a pile of piglets looks like a pile of dirt clods. So our friend the artist said, I think we should do some grain, because you can tell what that is from a long distance away. And there are other barns that we have also rehabbed. You can kind of see this one. Father Allen was bragging to me that he built that in 1951, and he didn't spend a nickel on it, because it was built mostly from pallets that he scrounged from different places. And you can see kind of the siding. If you look at it closely, you'll see that those are just pallets that are nailed to the side of that barn. But after 70 years, you can see the condition of it. And so all the trusses and everything were broken in it. So we set about repairing all of that, and then resheeting it, and then repainting that barn. And Father Allen was absolutely delighted that we had saved his personal project. He was the one who built that barn. This barn, also built in the early 50s. This is when it was being built, and this is when my son and his friend were taking down the old rotted wood and then redoing the outside there and painting it. And then there's can you back it up for just a second? One more right here. I want to. A good friend of mine, Lori Van Zandt, who's sitting right there. When the monastery was about to close, she did a beautiful garden design for us, and this was the centerpiece of it. Before, the statue of Mary was outside, but it was inside the quadrangle inside the monastery, and she was kind of falling apart. And Lori designed the most beautiful garden for the cemetery. Unfortunately, the monks, because they took a vow of poverty, they had no interest in spending money on anything. But I did talk them into going in together with us on this, to do this grotto area and to put Mary there. But Mary had been sitting outside for about 70 years, and so her face was falling off and her fingers were falling off. And so Mike went and found us a sculptor who repairs these Catholic statuary, and we had her all fixed up and took her to Wyoming and had her redone. And then the monks rededicated the grotto and the statue of Mary last year. And Father Brendan came and visited us for that time. He's now located in Ireland. He was in Ireland at that time, but now he's back at his home base in Iowa. But it's just, when I say it was like the worst thing I ever did and also the best thing, it's like I met so many amazing people. The kind of people who love to get involved, who love to volunteer, kind of like you folks here. I just made all these great friendships. And Lori did this beautiful design for us, and she is a true monastery nerd, along with Mike and I, and comes up there and feels the spirit all the time. And so what we've been trying to do is to preserve some of the aspects of it. Unfortunately, some of it was too far gone to save, which I'll explain in a minute. But the problem is, and I said this from the beginning, is that a monastery with no monks is missing a lot. And there were so many people who had such a close association with the monks. And then when they found out they were leaving, I mean, it was a real devastating blow to the community and to me. When I originally entered this agreement with the monks, they were supposed to stay there for the rest of their lives. Each of the 16 monks that were alive at the time that we bought this were granted a life estate on the property so they could live there for the rest of their lives. Unfortunately, a few years after we bought it, the abbot from Kentucky, who was their superior, came and he could see that they weren't getting proper medical care and they weren't really eating very well because they were in their 90s and they weren't really able to take care of themselves the way they were before. So he told them it was time to come home. And their home is actually in Kentucky at the Mother Monastery in Gethsemane. The monks did not like that idea very much. And in fact, they even asked me to intervene on their behalf, which was ridiculous. I have no say in the Catholic Church. But I went and pled their case with Father Elias, and I made a fool of myself and cried like a baby. Sorry. But he told me that as politely as he could to mind my own business. And he said, these monks are like our parents. And there'll come a time in your life when you have to tell your parents that they can no longer care for themselves. And he said, it's going to be really painful. And he says, that's what's happening to us right now. So, so they had a choice. They could either move back to Kentucky, where they have a big infirmary at the monastery, and they could live the rest of their lives there, or they could move to the Catholic rest home in Salt Lake City, St. Joseph's. So all of them decided to go to St. Joseph's because they wanted to stay together. And there were already a couple of monks living at St. Joseph's who had already gotten too infirm to live at the monastery. So they all moved to St. Joseph's together, but they missed the monastery, so we had these periodic picnics that Mike and Elaine and I would put together, where we would bring them up and feed them hamburgers and potato salad and chocolate cake and all the things, and Trappist beer, all the things that a monk loves. And we've been doing that ever since. And then in December, we were going to take them to lunch on the 16th, and we made the appointment with them on the 1st. And by the 16th, 2 of them had died of COVID. That's how quickly that disease took those two guys. The third monk, who was also infected, did recover. Father David is doing much better, but it was touch and go with him for a while as well. Anyway, one of the things that people ask me a lot about is, why did I tear down the Quonset hut? And I think everybody deserves an explanation, because I know a lot of you were very interested in that building and talked to me about it. So I have a love-hate relationship with the Quonset hut, mostly hate because it was full of asbestos and it cost me hundreds of thousands of dollars to remove that building. But I tried like crazy to save it, and 3 times I offered to give it away. The first time I offered to give it to Utah State University to use for student housing, because originally they were going to come to the monastery and take over once the monks left. They brought their engineers and architects up there, and they said, no way. So then I offered to give it to the Catholic Church, and along with the 5 most valuable acres on the property. And the bishop from Salt Lake came, and he was very kind, and he walked in the door and he looked at the stained glass and he said, we'll take that. Which was great, because I knew that it needed to go to a Catholic church, and that's where it is now. And he politely toured the building, and the local Catholic community held a week-long fast and prayer. There's a name for it, I don't know what it's called, to try and get the bishop to agree to take this project on. But he said it's just too expensive. That building is too dilapidated to take on. So then I finally offered to give it to you folks. I don't know if it was Utah State or Weber Heritage Foundation. Dr. Nelson brought up a team of people to look at the building, and they came up with a price tag, I think, of $12 million to bring it up to code. I said, if you have $12 million to fix this Quonset hut, it's yours.
Check my pockets.
Yeah. The thing is I think people have a very sentimental view of that building, and I do too, and I know Mike especially does. He wanted me to rebuild a new one just like it. But the monks themselves were not that nostalgic about it, because it wasn't meant to be their permanent structure. And they're not nostalgic for temporal things anyway. And I asked them what we should do with it, and they all said, tear it down. But I didn't want to, because it meant a lot to me and to a lot of other people, so we tried to save it. But in the end, Father David, who is the bookkeeper, reminded me that it costs $7,000 a month to heat it in the winter. It's 58,000 square feet, and it's not very well insulated. And so there really was no chance that ever was going to be saved, but we did our best. So now what we've done is we've removed the building, the asbestos, and all the remnants of it, and we've re-landscaped it into a sort of a park area. Now, if you've been up there, you've probably seen that. Go forward. So what we've been doing, I'm sorry, go back one. So what we've been doing since we took over is trying to bring the farm back into productivity. So when the monks stopped farming, I don't know, 20, 25 years ago, they leased the property to some local farmers, and a series of them came and went. But the lessees didn't put any money into the farm, and the equipment was from the 50s and 60s, the old wheel lines and hand lines, and the farm is losing a tremendous amount of money, which I can attest to. We've spent about $8,000 a week for every week we've owned the property. That's the losses. So to cure that problem, we have invested in 6 of these new pivot irrigation systems, which will irrigate most of the property. And that was our biggest loss, was labor costs moving those hand lines around. And we've replaced a lot of the pipelines that were from the 50s. And we still have more of that to go, but we've modernized the farm. We've invested in equipment and the water rights issues. And I think the farm is going to be able to be sustainable for the long term. Can you do the next slide? So what the plan is now is when the lease from the previous farmer was up and they were just growing alfalfa and mostly just using it to hunt elk, we wanted to do something that would allow people to have some reason to visit the monastery and to enjoy that again. Because up until now, we pretty much had to keep people out because nobody is there to keep an eye on the place, and I get robbed continually. So as luck would have it, I came across Kenny and Jan McFarland, who own a huge farm out in West Weber. And they're very successful farmers, and they grow pumpkins and onions and peppers and tomatoes and all kinds of other awesome stuff. And they have agreed to lease the monastery. So we're building a little barn for them to use as a produce stand down at the bottom of the monastery. And they're going to have a big pumpkin patch. And then they're also going to experiment with other types of crops that they could grow on the monastery. In the past, the monks grew all kinds of stuff. They grew wheat, they grew potatoes, and they had all kinds of farm animals and things like that. And the reason they stopped growing some of those crops is because every 4 or 5 years they'd have a killing frost and lose the whole crop. But the climate has changed enough that Kenny thinks that he might be able to bring some of those crops back, but he knows he can do pumpkins. I do pumpkins every year up there. I do tomatoes. There are other crops that grow up there, onions, things like that, cold weather crops that don't grow good in West Weber. But what he's also going to do, since he runs both farms, is he'll bring his sweet corn up to the farm stand in Huntsville so that people can have access to those great crops he grows in West Weber, and vice versa down at his other farm stand. So they run 13 farm stands along the Wasatch Front, and now they're going to run the monastery, and they're going to live at the monastery in the guest house during the summer to make sure that everything goes according to plan. And so hopefully there'll be a lot of reasons to come up there, but they also are going to do, probably not this summer because they're just getting started, but in the summers to come, up in the heart of the monastery where the cemetery is, they'll do like farm to table dinners and things like that. And so there'll be some events for people to come up to. We're hosting a concert for the Ogden Valley Land Trust in August up there. If anybody's dying to go back up there and enjoy the evening. So there'll be events up there so people will have some access to the property. The conservation easement, some people I think are confused and think it means it turns it into a giant public park. That's not the case. It's to stay exactly like it was before, which is a private farm, privately operated. And I do want people to be able to come up there. I just can't leave it open all the time because I can't afford to run a 1,500 acre private park. But I'm going to do the best I can to give you access so that you can enjoy the monastery and have events up there. And anyway, I've got a minute or two maybe for a couple of questions. I don't know where I'm on time.
Yeah, I'd say we've got 5-10 minutes for questions.
Okay. Mike?
You have to tell them 2 things.
Okay.
You have to tell them that that you're not a wealthy family and that you basically sold off your 401k to make this investment happen. So make sure you mention that, or else I will. And number two, tell them about your idea for a chapel in the Bell.
Okay. Okay. Some people confuse me. In fact, there was a rumor going around Huntsville that I was the famous Bill White from Park City, who owns all those great restaurants up in Park City. I wish that was me, but it's not. My wife and I, this is a huge stretch for us to do that, and we had hoped that there would be other people join us, but they were smart enough not to do that because this is a big money loser. But it's been stressful and difficult, but it's also been hugely rewarding because I've become very close friends with Mike and with the monks and with a lot of other people like Dr. Nelson and others who are really interested in preserving a little bit of the history of our valley and also some of the open space. And that has been, I mean, I volunteered in Huntsville town on the town council and planning commission, and I quickly figured out that the most fun people in town are all the volunteers, which I imagine this is a fun group of people because you're mostly volunteers. And those are the people you want to be with. You know, they have a lot of passion and love for things, and so that's been a real blessing. We hired an architect to design us a small chapel. I mean, it's not super small, but it's like 36 by 48 that is eventually going to be built up on the monastery, and that's where hopefully we'll be able to reinstall the bells. We still have the bells, and I would have already started, but we're running out of money, so we need to regroup a little bit. But and plus the building cost just went crazy this past year, so we decided to hold off on that. So I think that's one thing that would be kind of a fun event. Maybe there could be weddings. I don't know. I'm not even sure why I'm doing it. My wife asks me that all the time. Why are you building this chapel? It doesn't seem to have a purpose because there's no monks up there. I just feel called to do it. I don't know. I hope it has some purpose for being there. Maybe Christmas concerts or something. I don't know. Somebody will have an idea. If you build it, they will come, I suppose. Anyway.
I was just curious about something he said about architects and the Quonset huts. I was always under the impression that those Quonset huts were some sort of World War II surplus. But you make it sound like they were actually built intentionally for that? Is that the case?
Yes, so the World War II surplus was the initial huts they lived in. The Quonset hut, they hired an architect, designed it, and used the Quonset hut material, which may have been recycled material. I'm not certain about that. But that was intended to be temporary too, because the plan was to build a new monastery that wasn't a Quonset hut. Of course, the way things work out, you never expect. And the temporary Quonset hut became the permanent monastery.
Yeah, was it that design chosen just because it was cheap and did the job?
Yeah, it was readily available material right at the end of the war, and they thought, oh, we don't need to spend much time and money on this because we're only going to be in here a few years, right? So.
Just a question about the water. I may be subject for a whole other discussion, hour-long discussion or something. I don't know if it's off topic but is there a happy ending to the water situation up there? I don't really know anything.
Yeah. So when the monks first arrived, they filed an application to appropriate enough water to expand the farm to its current size. The amount of irrigated land when they showed up there was quite small. So what happens when you file an application and you get approval from the state, eventually you have to prove to them that you actually did what you requested, and you file what's called a proof. And then you have an engineer prove that you actually put all this water to beneficial use. Unfortunately, they made a huge mistake when they filed their proof back in the 60s, and they left out 135 acres of land. But they didn't know that, so they had been irrigating it unlawfully all that time. So because I'm a water rights attorney, and when I was doing my due diligence, I noticed this glaring error. And I went to the state engineer's office and talked to them about it, and their initial reaction was stop irrigating, which would have been a huge devastation for the farm because that would have been a big chunk of the farm that could no longer be irrigated. So my partner, Winston Wainsgard, and I spent the next year of our lives mustering this giant case to prove that this water right was a legitimate water right for the monastery. And luckily, the monks were still alive at the time, the guys who actually did the irrigating and could verify that they had been putting the water to beneficial use. But even despite that, there's never been a case where they would go back and change a water right filing from the 60s. So we had the support of the Utah State engineer, really fabulous guy named Kent Jones, and he fought his staff tooth and nail to get them on board, but eventually we had to get new legislation passed which would allow the state engineer the authority to change a certificate that dated back to the 60s because they are actually property rights under Utah law. So it does have a happy ending, and the real happy ending is that that water is now part of the conservation easement and so won't be sold off to some ski resort or something. We have been offered tens of millions of dollars for that water right because the water right in the valley has become suddenly this scarce commodity, and the ski resorts that are rapidly expanding are desperately searching for new water, but this water will be forever dedicated to this farm. Yes?
What about the cemetery? Has it been preserved? And you said the garden, what's been done with that?
Yeah, so the cemetery, I think that if you back up a couple, you'll see a picture here. So the cemetery is, you can see, well, there's a picture of it. If you go back one more, I think one more. Yeah, right there. So that's what the cemetery looks like now with Lori's addition of this grotto. The monastery building you can see right here is gone, and so that's been re-landscaped as part of the park. The monks haven't had a vegetable garden for quite a while, so this was their landscaped area. And so we just expanded that by quite a bit when we incorporated the area around the monastery. The monks that have died, all except for one, are still being buried there. Father Allen was just buried there. And the rest of them that are still living would like to be buried there and will be. It's really the Catholic Church obligation to take care of the monastery. I mean the cemetery, but I just kind of volunteered to do it during my lifetime because I was going to be there and I thought it was kind of an honor. And I've had a lot of people, like at the picnic we had on last August, I think it was, a lot of people said, I want to do something, I want to be a part of this, and they volunteered to come mow the lawn. I said, it's huge, it's like 3.5 hour mow job. But they wanted to be up there because they love the property, and so they volunteered to come and help me mow the lawn. And so it's really a beautiful little park setting now where the monks are buried, and it will just continue to be that way. It'll be preserved, just like it is now.
So, was it the chapel you were referring to when you weren't quite sure why you were doing it, or was it something else? You were referring to something.
But yes, about building the chapel. Yeah, this little replacement chapel that we designed. I can't, for the life of me, figure out what it's for. In fact, the abbot told me, he says, I don't know what you're doing this for. There isn't any reason for it, but.
Well, Mike talked about addition and subtraction, and the loss of the monks. Like, when you have these men here, and the prayer, that primarily they were there to pray.
Right.
I mean, they had a big farm to take care of, but that kind of prayer, I mean, not everybody's people of faith, but that changes a region. I mean, the subtraction that we've lost there, I don't know how we'll replace it, but I think the chapel might just have a role in that. I don't know, but just so you know, you'll find out eventually. And I wanted to say thank you so much for all you've done, because this is just an amazing. Developers were, I'm sure you went that they wanted that land so bad,
Yeah.
but it wasn't a divine plan for them to get it. But so I guess in a sense, I just want to say thank you for doing God's work, and God bless you.
Oh, that's really, really nice for you to say that. We just, when you end up volunteering for something, it's sometimes just because you're the guy standing there, and it sometimes it felt that way. It's like I feel like I'm in way over my head. I'm not a farmer. I'm not filthy rich. I don't have the capacity to do all this stuff. But the monks have been really, really supportive of us, and the love that people have for the monks has sort of got them excited about helping us, and a lot of people have been helping us get to the point we are now. And so, like I said, it's been the best of times and the worst of times, but mostly the best, and we are functionally done with the conservation easement. We're just waiting for it to be filed with the county. And it was all because of a lot of hard-working volunteers. And I should specifically mention Summit Land Conservancy out of Park City, who did the first conservation easement for us in Hennifer. This was outside of their zone, and they volunteered to help the Ogden Valley Land Trust because they didn't have the expertise to get this done. And there was really nothing in it for them. They just felt like that they needed to do this, and they have done a ton of work. I mean, for years they've been working on this with us. And Cheryl Fox is the executive director. She's amazing.
Bill, thank you. Thank you for what you've done, and kudos. Seriously.
Thanks.
We're neighbors up there, yours, of the monastery.
Uh-huh.
And so on behalf of many of your neighbors, I think there's that question that everybody's kind of waiting for.
Okay.
People that used to hike and ride their horses back, particularly in the south of that corner. Is there any chance or thought that you would one day reopen that to allow
Yeah.
that kind of recreational access beyond where your groomed farming is happening?
Right. I doubt it, to be honest, because I can't afford to be in charge of a giant public park, and I don't know who would be in charge if I wasn't. So in lieu of that, I've decided to make the monastery available for special events that are supervised, because I've had millions of hunters. I mean, the hunters are incredibly aggressive in their tactics, who used to sneak up on the property and go poach elk and so forth. And I talked to Brother Nicholas about that, and I said, these guys said that you gave him permission. And he said, I didn't give him permission, they just took it. And I just cannot absorb the liability of that. I can't be in charge of it, and I can't say no to 10 people and say yes to 10 people and say no to 500 other people. And so I think the compromise is that we make it available and open for special events that are supervised so that people can enjoy the monastery. But what the monastery farm is now is a private farm to grow vegetables and raise cattle. And it's just impossible to run something like that when you just have hundreds of people having free access to the property with no supervision. And I wish it wasn't that way, but it is that way. And most of the public who've come up there, I've caught hundreds of people trespassing, have been great, and they're just up there to enjoy the thing. But there's a certain percentage of people there who are robbing us, or who are vandalizing things, or who are stealing things. And I'm just one guy, and I just can't be in charge of that. And so we're going to continue to run it as a farm, and hope the benefits of having open space and not having congestion and 600 new homes is a good benefit for the valley. But that's about as much as I can do.
Can I add a footnote to that? I'll come up here too, so you can see me. Meeting people like Bill actually inspired me to write another book about the friendships that develop between the monks and their neighbors. There's just some beautiful stories about those relationships, including a monk who paid for the Latter-day Saint mission of one of his neighbors because the family couldn't afford it. Another son of a family told me that the monks kept them alive during a winter when his father was laid up with a serious injury from a horse kicking him. But one of the stories I'm including in the new book, which is called, by the way, In the Valley of Monks and Saints, is a story about Bill and Elaine. Because monasteries only survive when there are novices who join the monastery, younger men or women who commit themselves to the life and receive the legacy of the monastery and continue it. And one of the reasons Holy Trinity had to close was they weren't fortunate enough to have that influx of novices. So Bill's always too modest to accept this label I keep pinning to him and Elaine, but I call them the unexpected novices because through a series of coincidences, the monks would say it was divine providence because he's doing exactly what they wanted him to do with the land. But through those events, the monastery in some form is going to be preserved because we finally found the unexpected novices. And in Bill's case, it's a man who's not a monk, who's married, and who's not even a Catholic. Yet Father Brendan, Freeman, who was the last superior there, used to take Bill and sit with him on the porch of this tree house that Bill built and talk to him about the monastery and the land. And I call that the novitiate, the novice formation that occurred. And so I just want to emphasize that what the abbot who founded that monastery said 75 years ago, as I mentioned before, was, this place is near to heaven, so let's endeavor to make it more so. And during the next 70 years, the monks did just that. But it took someone like Bill and Elaine to keep that little bit of heaven on earth going. So I too am eternally grateful for what you're doing, that some bit of this beautiful place can survive.
That's appreciate that, Mike. Thank you.
Great. Thank you guys both. You don't have to sit down.
Oh,
I mean, you're the stars of the show, but I just want to say, I know we could talk about this for hours and hours. Alas, we have run out of time this time. But thank you all again for coming. Thank you so much. And again, on behalf of the community, thank you guys for taking the hit, the crazy hit that nobody else would take. And thank you for keeping these stories alive and for making all of this happen. Again, thank you guys for coming. There are treats and snacks in the dining room. There is art all around us, and there are books to purchase in the back here if you want. They're just $15 today. And we will set Mike up at the grand desk back there, and he will be available for book signings if you're interested. So again, thank everybody for coming. Thank you so much, and we're going to keep doing things like this every month. So keep an eye on the Heritage Foundation. Thanks again.